it shifts Indian perceptions of the United States. I mean, the United States
Yeah.
has gone from being extraordinarily popular in India to being, the new enemy number two, right, right after
Mm.
Pakistan. There's really been a complete shift in Indian media coverage, and not government, pro-government media coverage, all media coverage, government figures, opposition figures saying that the government's not doing enough to fight back against the United States. It really has completely shifted the narrative about the United States in India. And I think from the White House perspective, I just don't think Donald Trump cares.
Welcome back to The Focus. I'm John Bruni. India today sits at the center of global geopolitics. It's courted by Washington, friendly with Moscow, wary of Beijing, and still locked in a dangerous dance with Islamabad. For all the talk of an Indo-Pacific century, the question is, what role does India want to play in shaping it? To help us unpack this, I'm joined once again by Professor Salvatore Babones, one of the sharpest voices on international affairs and Indian foreign policy. For those who are unfamiliar, Salvatore Babones is an American born scholar and commentator, as well as an associate professor at the University of Sydney. He's known for his sharp takes on global politics and India's role in the world, breaking down complex issues clearly and engagingly. Salvatore, welcome back to The Focus.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here.
Salvatore, what did you make of Modi's appearance at the 2025 Shanghai Cooperation Organization about a month ago now? Did this summit with Modi, Xi, and Putin together signal shifting alliances or just Modi's displeasure with Trump?
What's funny is that from an Indian standpoint, it's absolutely routine. India is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, mainly at Russia's invitation. China wanted Pakistan as a member, and China and Russia kind of manage the SCO between them. Each time one country gets a friend in, the other country insists on having one of its friend in to maintain the balance. So India certainly has no particular friendship or warmth with China. Yet the meeting was in China, and the heads of state attend the meetings. So although Indian heads of state, or I'm sorry, heads of government have attended, uh, multiple meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the past, it's only because somebody was watching this time that it was interpreted as a snub for the United States or cozying up to China. But from an Indian standpoint, this wasn't an optional attendance issue. This was a routine matter. India is a member of multiple organizations and refuses to be tied down by what the West might consider desirable or politically correct.
Yeah, that is true, but obviously signaling in politics is everything. And I think that, America, it would be fair to say that America and India have kind of hit a bit of a rough patch recently.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think that if you were in Washington, D.C., you'd see this and you'd try to make a different kind of spin on things, right?
Oh, of course, of course. But I think it's a misunderstanding. So, from an Indian standpoint, it would have been a signal not to attend.
Right.
The attendance was absolutely routine. If India had refused to attend, that would have been a snub to both China and Russia. Now, the West might have applauded had India snubbed China and Russia, but from an Indian standpoint, there's no reason to snub China and Russia. India is not at war with Russia and Ukraine, and China has been relatively well behaved on the Himalayan frontier in recent years. So there was no real occasion for India to refuse to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, the closest you could come is that Chinese built fighter jets were used by Pakistan in the recent skirmish after the Pahalgam terrorist attacks. But American F-16s were used by Pakistan too. So,
Yeah.
that's hardly a reason not to go to China.
Hmm. Does the recent spat with Trump regarding Russian oil exports and tariffs, for instance, uh, does that shift the Trump administration's views on India's reliability?
It may, but much more importantly, it shifts Indian perceptions of the United States. I mean, the United States
Yeah.
has gone from being extraordinarily popular in India to being, the new enemy number two, right, right after
Mm.
Pakistan. There's really been a complete shift in Indian media coverage, and not government, pro-government media coverage, all media coverage, government figures, opposition figures saying that the government's not doing enough to fight back against the United States. It really has completely shifted the narrative about the United States in India. And I think from the White House perspective, I just don't think Donald Trump cares. Both Donald Trump and Narendra Modi share only one thing. I mean, they're very different people. Narendra Modi is very serious, very stuffy, very buttoned up. Donald Trump, of course, is spewing out memes on the White House Twitter channel. The only one thing they have in common is each of them only cares about his own domestic politics. From
Yeah.
Narendra Modi's standpoint, standing up to Donald Trump when no other world leader is willing to, take a stand against him, that makes him a hero at home. And of course, from Trump's standpoint, putting it to any non-American world leader is MAGA gold, right? So
Mm.
both of them are playing domestic politics. That said, I don't think there's any lasting animosity behind it. I think once this is cleared up, it'll all be cleared up. I don't think there's anything permanent going on.
Well, that's kind of interesting because we recently had the former Director General of Indian Artillery, Lieutenant General
Hmm.
Ravi Shankar, on, and he gave im- a very passionate
Yeah,
Indian view on how things are going, and he tends to think that India is doing okay. It's
yeah,
doing okay even without the United States.
yeah. That's
But of
correct.
but of course there are these other practical issues at stake, and that is that in spite of the political stuff that we're seeing, the Indian military is still training and supporting with American forces around the
Yeah,
Indo-Pacific. Um, there are still things that are happening behind the scenes that most of our audience may not be aware of. For instance, there is a memorandum of understanding for new fighter jet engines, the
right.
F414s, which will go into their Tejas fighter.
Yeah.
Um,
And new
now,
helicopters and new
new
small
helicopters,
arms and yeah,
absolutely, absolutely, all of that.
yeah, new
Those
artillery.
things
Yeah.
aren't being imperiled by anything that we're seeing at the moment, right?
Well, from Trump's standpoint, the deal, quote unquote, that will end this is that he'll get a big order for Indian military
Uh-huh.
hardware. And from India's standpoint, that would be fine. Look, I just think this is all a tempest in a teacup.
Mm.
It is great politics. It's great theater. I guarantee you that in 2026, we won't be talking about it. It will have long since blown over, just like the Gulf of America has blown over. Who talks about the Gulf of America these days? And Canada becoming North Dakota. That was a huge issue. Was the United States going to invade? Do you remember the U.S. was going to invade Greenland as well?
Oh
And
yeah, yeah,
everyone,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's now dropped off the list. And this is the Trump way. He wants to get what he wants from India. India is not going to give it to him. There will be a face-saving agreement. The real thing that has happened is it has awakened the Indian population to the perils of relying too much on the United States. And there's been a huge nationalist outpouring. Again, both pro-Modi and anti-Modi. I mean, all sides of Indian politics, a huge nationalist outpouring, stand up for India. And, it won't make much practical difference because India needs the US market. India needs US technology cooperation. The synergies are just so strong that this will blow over, just like US Canada relations have healed, just like US Mexican relations have healed very quickly after what were much more intense Trump offensives. I mean, the Trump
Mm.
offensive against Canada was to remove its prime minister and incorporate Canada into the United States. And if that issue can die down, this issue can die down as well.
Well, you make mention about the perils of India relying on the United States. there has to be some sort of deep-seated concern among some people in the Indian government, even when they sign the form to conduct an MOU to get some really important piece of kit out of the United
Yeah.
States, when the current American government seems so flaky, it seems so tempestuous. I mean, what I'm getting from you is that, yes, this is a storm in a teacup, but what I'm getting from Indians generally when I'm, trying to ascertain what their feeling is, and that
Yeah.
is that there is this genuine anger, and that anger isn't just the public. It's not the people who are absorbing the media stories and saying, "Oh my God, this is terrible, we got to do something about it." It also drives up the chain into government as well. I'm wondering, Salvatore, with your knowledge on India, what do you say about people whose opinions who really matter, those sitting,
Yeah.
around Modi, if not Modi himself, are they really affected by the rhetorical shift that is happening before us, or is it all just smoke and wind?
The anger is temporary, the wariness is permanent, and that wariness
Mm,
predates Donald Trump. There was a lot of fear that the
true.
Biden administration would put human rights sanctions on India, and Eric Garcetti, the Biden era ambassador to U.S. ambassador to India, was very controversial because he had in the past called for sanctions on India due to what he perceived as human rights transgressions in India. And so it's not just a Trump thing, it's a US thing. The fear that the US would not be an all-weather reliable partner. And that fear is well justified. The US, I mean, I'm an American. I don't take any particular pride in saying this, but the fact is the U.S. is not a reliable all-weather partner. The United States is has political interests, not just interests. I mean, I'm not even a foreign policy realist about this. The United States has many political constituencies that want different things, and it's a democracy. And in a democracy, people tend to get what they want, at least when it comes to relations with foreign countries. So India, when it views Russia as a potential supplier, thinks if I pay cash to Russia, I'm going to get the goods. Assuming that there's manufacturing capacity, assuming Russia doesn't get caught in the Ukraine war where it needs the goods itself. But in general, Russia is a cash and carry supplier. Now, not just Russia. India relies for much of its very highest defense technology, fourth generation fighter jets, nuclear attack submarines. It relies on France. Because
Yeah.
again, France is a cash and carry supplier. France is never going to sanction India, never going to say we will no longer sell you spare parts because we disagree with your policy on this or that, or because a domestic voting constituency in France doesn't like the Indian government. That's not going to happen. In the United States, of course, it happens all the time. There's strong pressure, for example, in the US to discontinue the defense relationship with Saudi Arabia over the war in Yemen. Now, it didn't happen, but the pressure was very strong, especially during the Biden years. The U.S. has cut off other countries. The U.S. cut off Pakistan for that matter, despite the fact that Pakistan is recognized as a major non-NATO ally, thus, in theory, giving it access to the best of the best U.S. technology. The U.S. for many years cut off Pakistan from supplies from spare parts for its F-16s. Now that's been restored, but the issue was terrorism and Pakistan's support for international terrorism. Iran is still trying to fly F-15s from the 1970s that it can't keep airworthy because the U.S. obviously is not going to sell defense equipment to Iran. So, the idea that there would be a long-term reliance on a country as flaky as the United States, not as flaky as Donald Trump, the current president, but as flaky as the United States is just a non-starter in India.
Hmm. When we're talking about political perceptions, Salvatore, what do you know of how Indians see how Trump has been berating his closest allies or not being seen to be supporting them in whatever they think is important? I mean, do they come away thinking worse thoughts about America today as opposed to their more traditional
Mhm.
doubts about America? Is there
Oh yeah.
something fundamentally different about how India sees America today as opposed to, say, the Biden administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration? What is that difference? I really want to get to the nub of
Oh,
this.
the the Hindu internet has now come to see the United States, not just Donald Trump, but the
Yeah.
United States in general, is thoroughly anti-Hindu, full of anti-Hindu discrimination. They view the restrictions on H-1B visas for Indian tech workers has been perceived to be a nativist, anti-India, anti-Hindu, racist move. There's been an awful lot of that language coming out by mostly reputable people, not ideologues on either extreme in Indian politics, but a broad sense among Hindu Indians that the U.S. is now against them. They were wary about the Biden administration, but in the wake of, and I think largely cautiously or guardedly optimistic when Donald Trump was elected, but now they've come to view Donald Trump as stoking nativist, right-wing, anti-Hindu feelings in America. And I get asked about this all the time, to which I have to tell Indians I don't live in the U.S. anymore. I view the U.S. from abroad, but that said, I don't think there's any deep-seated, rural cotton belt racist anti-Hinduism in the United States, but nonetheless, many Hindus believe that. Strangely, at a time when the Trump administration has done much to reach out to Hindu American voters, not to Indian Hindus, but to Hindu American voters. And quietly, for example, there was a major controversy over the BAPS Akshardham in Robbinsville, New Jersey. The Biden administration had raided the temple, had started a civil rights investigation into what they perceived as use of slave labor at the temple for the religious workers who were carving the figures, and all that was dropped by the Trump administration. So a big but quiet win for Hindu Americans at a time when in India, Hindu Indians have become convinced that the U.S. is more racist than ever.
Well, that's interesting because, again, I look at it from a different perspective. I look at the United States and I start to slowly see a sort of latent multiculturalism stepping forward even in the elite circles. I mean, you've got J.D. Vance, whose wife is Indian.
Yeah.
You had one of the presidential contenders who was Ramaswamy.
Yeah.
These things may how do they play out in India?
Well,
Was there a
Kamala
sort of
Harris, I mean,
well,
herself,
okay, well,
vice president. Yeah.
she's a mixer. She may not resonate as well. But again, when you see people that have ties, blood ties back to India in the American political elite, does that fill India with any degree of confidence that things are moving up for them because they have reach into the White House because people aren't seeing Hindus or
Uh,
Indians as scary? I don't know.
Yeah, not particularly, because Hindu Americans and Indian Americans in general. But here, first I should explain: in the diaspora, Hindu Indians tend to overwhelmingly identify as Indian in the diaspora, whereas Muslim Indians in the diaspora tend to overwhelmingly identify as Muslim. That is, they cohabit, socialize with, join organizations that are not primarily Indian organizations, but are primarily Muslim organizations. So the success of Hindu Americans in the United States has come with a degree of, yeah, yeah, I don't want to say Schadenfreude. It's not that. It's a sense that the people who have made it in America are people who've turned their backs on India. That is, it's striking that many successful Indian American politicians and corporate leaders know relatively little about India and have no particular connections to India, don't do much to try to um, help promote better U.S.-India relations. And that's because the U.S. is a very absorbing culture. I mean, German Americans fought against Germany in two world wars without any issue being raised about, no, we can't. Italian Americans, my own uncles, great uncles, fought against fascist Italy, despite the fact that, their parents had emigrated from Italy. America is an absorbing culture that, Hindu Americans are not Indian. They're Hindu.
Yeah.
They're absolutely Hindu, but they've really lost a connection with India. And in Indian Hindu online circles, uh, that's often seen that the ignorance about India of Hindu Americans is often highlighted. in their online discourses.
Turning on to more practical matters, matters regarding energy. Um, Ukrainian military strikes against Russian refineries have clearly undermined Russia's ability to supply oil to India. However, as I noted earlier, we had our recent guest on, Ravi Shankar, who told us that India could easily switch suppliers.
Yeah.
India imports about 40% of its oil from the Gulf and around 37% from Russia. Do you agree that replacing Russian supply will be simple, or is that too optimistic, especially now that Moscow has banned oil exports until 2026?
Yeah, he's right. It's not an issue at all. India has been taking advantage of low-cost Russian oil simply because it was legal under
Right.
UN sanctions. I mean, and I should stress to viewers, India has been complying with the US sponsored anti-Russia sanctions. Those sanctions were designed to lower the maximum price that Russia could obtain for its oil overseas. And that oil's on the international market. And
Yep.
India, like China, has simply been buying it up. There's no real risk for India's energy security because, unknown to much of the world, India's number one export is refined petroleum.
Mm.
India is a major refining center for petroleum that then goes back to the Persian Gulf, but more of it goes to Southeast Asia. So tankers arrive in India with this Russian oil, it gets refined, and then it's re-exported as refined petroleum products. If that export industry is hurt to some extent by a reduction in, or by an increase in the average price of the oil that it purchases, well, that's a commercial issue. They've been making hay for 2 years, and now they're going to go back to normal business operations. But there's no issue for India's own domestic energy supply because India is a massive refined petroleum exporter. So any reduction would simply be a reduction in India's exports, not a reduction in oil supply to the Indian economy.
So basically, what we're seeing at the moment will not cause Indian citizens to freak out because of rising petrol prices or inflation. That's not on the cards, right?
Look, there could be some very minor oil price inflation and energy price inflation in India, but it would not be a major issue. Most of that Russian oil was going out for re-export, and it was a big boost to India's petroleum exporting industry to have that cheap supply of oil. What will happen is there'll be a decline in gross Indian exports. So the Indian economy will take a little hit, but
Mm.
put in the context of India's economic growth, it's really just not a major issue. I'm not a stock market speculator. There will be individual Indian corporates that are severely affected by no longer being able to buy cheap Russian oil. But from an economic standpoint, the broad economy will hardly feel it.
If we go into the balance of power as far as India is concerned on the world stage, Salvatore, is India the smallest of the contemporary great powers or the largest of the middle powers?
Depends what you mean by great power. I would say there are really only three, maybe four great, quote unquote, great powers in the world. Because when I say great powers, I mean countries that have the wherewithal and the intention to project power beyond their borders. The United States does, obviously. The United Kingdom does. France does. Russia has, but is now, with the war in Ukraine, no longer really able to play a global role. That's three and a half. China's another half. China has the uh, developing capacity, but still is very limited. I mean, China has lots of military kit. What it doesn't have is things like refueling tanker, air-to-air refueling tankers, fleet support vessels, the sorts of things. China's aircraft carriers, for example, just routinely run up and down and up and down the Chinese
Mm.
coastline. We haven't heard anything about Chinese aircraft carriers, off the coast of Australia. Now, there were
Yep.
some, China's beginning, there was a Chinese naval exercise in the Tasman Sea, but it was very small scale from what I understand. So let's call China half a great power, Russia half a great power, then maybe there are four, five great powers. India, although it has the wherewithal to project power, it has never done so and has strong policy settings against doing so. and shows no signs of any interest in projecting power. I've actually just started to see the very first ripples in India of people talking about, to be a great country and a great civilization like the United States, like China, India also has to have overseas bases. And the question is, overseas bases where? For what purpose? What is India going to do in Africa or Southeast Asia or the Middle East? It's not clear. Some, again, highly nationalistic commentators in India have just this year, and I've only seen it in 2025, just this year begun calling for India to have global power projection capabilities. But there's no sign that the government is interested in that. There's no sign that voters are interested in that. It seems to be a small number of intellectuals who desperately wish that they could be writing, they could also be writing about what India should do in Africa and what India should do in the Middle East. But at this point, it's a minor ripple in the intellectual sphere. It's not a reality.
One of the perennial concerns when looking at other powers and how they're situated in the global environment, one is often looking at whether or not a country is a land power or a naval power.
Yeah.
And it's funny when you look at that sort of thing. And you look at the United States was a continental land
Yeah.
power until it wasn't. It made
Yeah.
the decision to become a
Till
maritime power.
1917. Yeah.
Exactly. And really that was just accelerated through
Yeah.
World War
World War
II.
II. Yeah. Obviously.
So then we have, China, which is again traditionally considered a land power. It had its high time in the 1440s where Admiral Zhang He had the treasure fleet, and that traveled as far as a then contemporary wooden fleet could travel, and it was spectacular. But again, the threat posed by the Mongols
Yeah.
meant that the Chinese court decided to, create walls, and so, the fleet
Yeah.
was burnt, and they built walls, just like a certain contemporary power seems to be doing right now. Oh no, I better not say that. But but anyway, you know what I'm getting at. So with India, then, if we transpose all of that to India, what is India as a power? Is it a land power? It's got a huge army, but its navy is not without some limited form of power projection. It's got a couple of aircraft carriers.
Right.
It's a relatively well balanced fleet, and it's certainly much larger than what Australia could field. So, what is India as a power?
First, the aircraft carriers. India has aircraft carriers as a matter of national pride, not as a matter of naval strategy. And I think smart Indian strategists are aware of that and view the aircraft carriers as an expensive boondoggle that India. Well, I'm serious. And there's discourse
No,
on
no,
this in
that's
India that
yeah,
that unless India wants to project power in the Red Sea,
yeah.
it doesn't need aircraft carriers. But there's a narrative that a strong country has aircraft carriers. After all, China has them, and if China has them, India should have them. And so it has aircraft carriers. But beyond the aircraft carriers, it really doesn't have any tools of power projection. There's no bases abroad. It hasn't, developed its military footprint to have any, or its military capacity to have any power projection uh, capabilities. And there's no appetite for that in India. There's not even appetite in India for seizing back land that was taken by China in its 1960
62.
two. Thank you. I was about to say 61, 62 invasion of India. There's always some talk about attacking Pakistan in the wake of the Pahalgam terrorist attacks, where Pakistan supported terrorists, murdered several dozen people in uh, Indian-controlled Kashmir. There were talks that India should invade Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and take it back. Not that it necessarily was ever in India to begin with, but that's considered kind of crazy talk in India. Um, and beyond Pakistan, you know, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, beyond this immediate border zone, um, there's no interest in India in projecting power any further. I mean, we could imagine India becoming a global sea power. After all, I expect that the Indian economy will overtake the Chinese economy sometime around 2040 or in the early 2040s. India will have the capacity to do that. But without a massive change in culture, there's just no appetite for it. I mean, I've just haven't seen any interest, and I state this categorically, among Indians, Indian intellectuals, Indian commentators, to get involved in the affairs of other countries. It's India just isn't interested, again, beyond its immediate neighborhood. And its military is definitely designed to operate in India's immediate neighborhood, not to project abroad.
Okay, so Ravi Shankar was saying to us that he considers that Pakistan and China are not two different threats to India. They are one threat.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that assessment?
The um, the better metaphor is the cat's paw
Right.
metaphor. China arms Pakistan to keep India busy.
Mm.
But there are no signs of meaningful defense cooperation between China and Pakistan. The clashes that occur on the Pakistan frontier are not timed to coincide with clashes on the China frontier. There's been no, yeah, there's just no evidence of real coordination. There's lots of talk about it. I mean, China always talks about Pakistan as its closest ally, as close as lips and teeth is the metaphor they love to use. But there are no signs of it. China has put a lot of money into Pakistan. It's put a lot of military equipment into Pakistan, but mainly to keep India busy, I think, more than out of any actual realistic cooperation.
Mm. So, when we talk about the balance of power generally in the region, one thing that you and I haven't spoken about, and I'd like to get your view on, and that is recent talks about Pakistan and Saudi Arabia doing closer military to military cooperation.
Yeah,
Now, many, many years ago, and you might recall exactly when, but I can't right now, but many, many years ago, there was talk that if ever Saudi Arabia wanted to go nuclear, they could just basically deliver a bunch of brown paper bags of money
yeah.
to Islamabad, and they would be able to get a nuclear weapon out of Pakistan. Is the idea of a growing Saudi Pakistani cooperation, military cooperation, a threat to any degree with regard to India and its role in South Asia?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is that Pakistan has always called, or repeatedly, I shouldn't say always, is repeatedly called its atomic bomb the Islamic bomb, and
Right.
tried to stress, but that's not in the sense of it's going to share. That's in the sense that Pakistan wants to be the leader of the Muslim world. That ambition goes all the way back to Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the first president of Pakistan, who wanted to be, he wanted to resurrect the caliphate. He wanted to take over where the Ottomans had left off, and become, the new Ottomans of the Middle East. Now that happened to a little extent. There were Pakistani military manning the Saudi armed forces in the 1950s and 60s, in the early years of Pakistan. But Pakistan's military prestige is not what it used to be. The Pakistan Army and Air Force have repeatedly failed in its operations against India and its attempts to attack India. Uh, and on top of all that, Saudi Arabia, despite its recent rhetoric to try to bring China in, bring Pakistan in. That's all just to get closer ties with the U.S. Whenever Saudi Arabia feels it's not getting what it wants from the U.S., it can invite China to come on a diplomatic visit. But practically speaking, Saudi Arabia is an American vassal state, and no, Pakistan is not going to become a local military hegemon. It just doesn't have the economic strength to do it. Now, could it sell Saudi Arabia nuclear technology? I don't know. I'm not a specialist in that area. If it ever got sufficiently desperate for money, I suppose it's a possibility. But I think Pakistan would much rather be the boss in any relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I don't think Saudis are likely to allow that ever to happen. Pakistan is never going to be the top dog in relations with Saudi Arabia, and that's the only basis on which Pakistan would make such an arrangement.
Okay, so Salvatore, if we just revisit some of what we were talking about earlier with regard to diaspora networks, Indian diaspora networks, with regard to those networks, have they had any role in shaping India's notions of its own version of global multipolarity? We've got large communities not only in the United States, but Europe, Australia, the Gulf states. Is this something that New Delhi sees as extensions outwards, or are these diaspora communities pretty pretty much integrating within their new
Yeah.
norms and conditions to wherever they've settled?
There's always a lot of rhetoric about integrating the diaspora, not only from the Indian government, but also from the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayansemak Sangh. That's the
Right.
national volunteer organization of which Narendra Modi is a key volunteer. He's literally a lifelong pracharak or volunteer in the organization. Both have had efforts for decades now to keep Indians abroad connected to India. And those efforts have singularly failed. The fact is that Indians abroad have, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, have in Australia, have really integrated into their host societies, and they're not very interested in getting anything from India other than visa-free travel. They want to go visit
Right.
family and doing business. They'd like to make profits in India, but they're not really fighting India's corner, in these countries. And as item number one for that is that we never see articles by Indian Australians in the Australian media advocating India's side in
Mm.
conflicts. I mean, it's virtually unheard of. We never see articles from Indian Americans, advocating India's side. If anything, it's the other way. It's diaspora critics of India who attempt to mobilize Australian institutions and mobilize American institutions to criticize India. And the chief example of that is the Sikh diaspora in Canada, which continues talking about an independent Khalistan and a Sikh state, continues to beat this drum, despite the fact that there's no Khalistani activism in India itself. Yet in the diaspora, this effort to undermine India lives on. So although Indian diplomats would love to be able to leverage the diaspora community to improve relations between India and their host countries, it's just not happening.
Well, that's interesting because, when I recall Modi coming out to Australia or Modi going off to the United States and seeing
Oh, he's
President Trump,
popular. Oh,
oh,
yeah.
it's very, very popular. So that doesn't translate into anything meaningful at all. But to people who are outside of that community looking at these large rallies, I mean, it does look quite, well,
Well,
the
he's a
Indian Prime
celebrity.
Minister's.
I mean, let me put that in
Yeah,
context.
yeah, please.
Narendra Modi has generally over a 70% approval rating over the long
Mm.
term in polls over 10 years in India. Yet at the latest election, his party only got 32% of the vote. Um, Modi's very popular. It doesn't mean they're going to vote for him. It doesn't mean they're going to do anything for him. It just means that, go Narendra Modi, right? It just means that people view him as a celebrity, as a symbol that they enjoy. And I
Right.
think many people in the diaspora enjoy the idea of India being resurgent, of India being an important country. But practically speaking, they're not advocating for India. And I might add in the same way that, for example, Chinese Australians don't advocate for China. Yes, in the Chinese Australian diaspora, there are a few Chinese agents and Chinese Communist Party organizers, but among the broad, if you just think of ordinary Chinese business people in Australia,
Yeah.
they're not advocating for anything regarding ties with China. That's the old country.
Mm.
All they want is to be able to visit
Yeah.
and to bring their grandparents, and but these are practical family considerations, not geopolitical considerations.
Okay, so Salvatore, what does Indian soft power look like?
Indian soft power is very successful in the non-Western world. In the non-Western world, India is a just consistent, patient friend of everybody. And it's remarkable that, majority Hindu India, run by, a very, very Hindu prime minister, who makes no bones about his Hindu devotion and Hindu faith and uses Hindu language and iconography, that he goes to the United Arab Emirates, a theocratic Muslim country, and is well received there and well respected, and has great relations. Goes to Muslim majority countries in Africa, and again, no problems. Well received, well and admired. India does maintains strong friendly relationships throughout the third world, and in some sense, that idea of India as the leader of the third world, which was a Nehruvian ambition back in the 1950s and 60s, is even more of a reality today than it was then. On the other hand, India has been singularly unsuccessful in promoting its soft power in the developed world, where anti-India rhetoric, some of it clearly funded by China, some of it clearly funded by Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, some of it simply Indians abroad who want to mobilize the resources of their host countries to fight their battles back in India. For all three of these reasons, uh, India has not succeeded. It is now well accepted among journalists and politicians and think tankers in Western countries that India is a non-democracy or an authoritarian country similar to Russia, that India is, well, an apologist for Vladimir Putin, as you started off with today, that India is cozying up to China. These narratives have wide purchase in our developed countries. They're not true, but the fact that India has not been successful, and frankly, has not even really tried to change these narratives, is really striking.
They haven't because they know that it's wrong and they just let the West flounder around with their preconceived ideas. I mean, that's got to reflect a little bit on them as well. Not in a good way.
I honestly don't know, and this has been a big mystery to me. Why doesn't the Indian Ministry of External Affairs care to be perceived, that India be perceived as a democratic country with a good human rights record? The only conclusion I've been able to come to is that the current government in India, at least, views attacks on it by the West as politically useful, that it gets them votes to be defending India against these neo-colonialists. And so they don't attempt to tell India's story because, it's fine if Donald Trump attacks India, Narendra Modi can rise to India's defense and gain a few extra votes from it. If Joe Biden is going to put human rights sanctions on India, Narendra Modi can rise to it. And not just Narendra Modi, I mean, previous Indian governments, the Congress Party governments, also were, reveled, not, I wouldn't say reveled in anti-West, in anti-India sentiment in the West, but were singularly unbothered by it, uh, which is really striking. I mean, it was under the previous Indian government, the supposedly secularist Congress Party, the Manmohan Singh administration, before 2014, that India was first named by the US State Department as one of the worst countries in the world for freedom of religion. And they didn't make any protestation, that, no official note was sent. No, they didn't try to correct the record. They just said, it's none of your business what is done in India. Same kind of response that Russia would make. So I don't quite understand it. I can only view it as a political decision. But the fact is that India does not even attempt in any meaningful way to do soft power in the Western world. I don't really know why, but they don't do it.
Well, suppose that perhaps, even if not directly, it serves some sort of purpose. Maybe it makes India look a bit fiercer on the international stage.
John, I just don't understand it.
Uh,
The effort simply isn't made.
Mm.
And I'm often accused of being in the pay of India. The Indian government is somehow secretly supporting my work. And I can tell you categorically, I I've gotten nothing, and I've asked. I've actually gotten asked that if you can give us grant money, we can develop something at an Australian university that
Mm.
could completely change the world's perception of India just by bringing in facts about India, and no interest.
Maybe they learned
It's
a little
just
bit.
not there. And
Yeah.
and so if even I, who just published a book on Indian democracy and how fantastic Indian democracy is, if even I get no support from the Indian government, who's going to? No, the Indian government just doesn't do soft power, at least not in the West.
You're
Uh,
destroying all my ideas of thinking that there's some grand conspiracy out there, Salvatore. I'm very
I
disappointed.
wish there were. Look, they just don't do soft power,
Yeah.
and that's strange for such a large and globally important country. Uh, but it's just the truth, and not just in
Yeah.
Australia. In
Yeah.
Australia, in the U.S., in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, soft power. The only thing they do is promote the International Day of Yoga. That's the big event in India's soft power arsenal is yoga. And still, very few yoga practitioners register any connection to India when they practice yoga. And that's the one thing they put money into is promoting the connection between yoga and India.
Oh, Bollywood movies are very big in the Gulf states. I remember when I was living there, Indian cinemas were very popular even among the Muslim
Oh
community. I
yeah,
mean,
Indian cinema is popular in Russia.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
go
there's
figure.
lots of, but none of it is government promoted or
Right,
supported, or
right.
it happens because the movies are good. I mean, I get Indian movies on Netflix.
Mm, mm.
RRR, the big Indian epic, was
Yeah.
popular in the United States, and mainstream non-Hindu, non-Indian YouTubers were talking about how fantastic RRR was. But
I have to see it. It's on my list. I'm just gonna have
it's
to
a
tick
lot of
that one
fun.
off. Yeah.
It's very Indian.
Yeah, yeah. It looks it from the shorts for sure. So,
Yeah.
Salvatore, when we are looking at, you were mentioning earlier about the RSS or the National Volunteer Organization. Now it's coming up to its 100th anniversary.
Today, as we
S-
record, yeah.
right, and some people say it's like India's version of the Boy Scouts. Other people say that it's like the Nazi Party. I mean, can you tell our audience exactly what the RSS means to India and to Indians generally?
The RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Savak Sang, sorry, I can't say it either. It
I'm glad you
is,
said it though.
no, no, I trip up over. I don't speak Hindi. I should be clear. I study India as a statistician and a sociologist, not as a cultural expert. The RSS is India's largest civil society organization with something like around 8 million members, but it depends what a member is. Whether someone attending an event is a member is difficult to say. Uh, Narendra Modi, notably, is a pracharak, or I think that the best translation of that would be activist, which means is to say he's devoted his whole life to the
Right.
RSS.
Mhm.
He was married as a teenager and then promptly left his wife, not left his wife in the sense of divorce, but left her behind to join the RSS and has done nothing but RSS work his entire life. And people, these pracharaks do join the RSS, and that's much more than a member. There aren't 8 million pracharaks, but they devote their life to propagating the cause of Indian nationalism and a specifically Hindu variation of Indian nationalism. And the RSS does support primarily Hindu-oriented organizations, the most prominent one being the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the World Hindu Council, which operates as an umbrella organization for Hindu faith groups around the world, not just in India. The RSS also has Muslim organization offshoots, but they're mainly window dressing. They have no meaningful membership numbers and no meaningful popular engagement. I think they're mainly there just to demonstrate that the RSS is not only for Hindus. But in practice, it is a Hindu organization that makes no secret. Just go to the website. It'll tell you about it trying to promote Hindu values and a Hindu civilizational identity for India. The organization is controversial because it is somewhat secretive. It doesn't have it now has a very national footprint and is highly bureaucratized, but in its early years it had been banned multiple times, and so it as any organization that is liable to be banned, it operates in the shadows to some extent. Now today it's too large to operate in the shadows, but it still is not clear. It's often said that you can work alongside an RSS man, and the RSS is an all-male organization. There's a female auxiliary, but the RSS is an all-male organization. It's often said you can work beside an RSS man your entire life and never know that he's with the RSS because they don't talk about it. They don't make a big deal of it. They quietly promote their causes. Now, partly what they do is promote good works. They do a lot of relief work. Whenever there's a flood, the RSS will show up to provide tents and shelter because they're very well organized and they're very dedicated to service. Whenever there's an attack, a problem, the RSS is there to try to help out. On the other hand, the RSS has been implicated in religiously motivated violence. So, for example, when the Babri Masjid, the Babur Mosque in Ayodhya was torn down, it was torn down by activists associated with the RSS and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the VHP. Whenever there's Hindu-Muslim street violence, there's always a question of, are the people on the Hindu side with the RSS? Sometimes they are, most times they're not. The RSS tends to be much more highly disciplined than more local and fringe Hindu groups. And thus the RSS tends not to get involved in actual violence. Most of that occurs outside of the RSS fold. So it's a highly controversial organization. The BJP, India's governing party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is an RSS organ. That is, it's part of the broader RSS family, which is called the Sangh Parivar. The Sangh being the organization, Parivar just meaning family. So the organization family includes the World Hindu Council, other trade unions, student groups, other organizations that are under the broader RSS umbrella.
In terms of how the RSS is seen by India's minorities, and especially the Muslims, for what you've just said,
and Christians,
and Christians and Sikhs and everyone else that happens to be non-Hindu, how are they perceived by these communities in India?
So first of all, Sikhs are, although generally not members of the RSS, they are considered by the RSS to be within the broader Hindu, or one might say dharmic fold.
Right.
So
glad you clarified
Hindu,
that. Yep.
Sikh, Buddhist are all perceived by the RSS to be part of the same family of religions. And Sikhs, to some extent, can be viewed as a Hindu warrior caste with its own customs. Now, that's not how Sikhs view themselves, but Sikhs can be viewed that way. The real challenge is with Abrahamic religions, with Christianity and Islam. And the big challenge is that both Christianity and Islam believe in proselytization and going out and converting people, whereas Hindus generally don't engage in conversion. They're not trying to convince non-Hindus to become Hindu. So inevitably, there are clashes where Muslims and especially Christians want to convert people to their religion. And the RSS is very anti-conversion, essentially taking the view that we won't try to take yours, you shouldn't try to take ours, if I just put it in the most blatant terms. It's also seen as an exclusionary organization in that although it allows Muslim and Christian members, and I've met Muslim and Christian RSS members, they do exist. But although it admits Muslim and Christian members, it admits them on the terms that they should embrace a Hindu identity for India, viewing India as a Hindu country. And it's much the same way, you mentioned the Boy Scouts earlier, as in there was nothing preventing a Jewish child becoming a Boy Scout in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s. But the Boy Scout was a Christian organization. It had Christian prayer. It was non-denominational, but it was suffused with Christian imagery and with Christian thinking. And so although you could become a member, the assumption was that you would just go along with the inherent Christianity of the organization. And the RSS is much the same way. It wants Muslim and Christian Indians to accept that India is a Hindu culture society. And nothing reflects that more than the dispute over the name of India. So the Indian Constitution has a strange formulation. It says, India, that is Bharat, is a secular socialist republic, and then goes on in the preamble.
Right.
Bharat is the Sanskrit name for India, but it's not just Sanskrit language. It comes from the Mahabharata. Mahabharata literally means the Great India Epic. Maha in Sanskrit is cognate with mega in Greek, so it literally means like mega India, Mahabharat. And the whole idea of Bharat, King Bharat, was supposed to be a Hindu king who was descended from Agni, the original Hindu god, the founder of the universe. So the idea of calling India Bharat is very tied into Hindu iconography. Yet that's what the RSS calls India. That's what I strongly suspect, want to change the name to. So right now, India is known internationally as India. I strongly suspect that within the next few years, the name of India internationally will be changed to Bharat, much as Bombay has become Mumbai and Bangalore has become Bengaluru and Calcutta has been Kolkata. We'll see the change of the name of the country. Now, where does that put Muslim and Christian Indians in the national identity? It's difficult to say. I mean, but it's a similar problem to the problem we have in places like Germany and Sweden. Sweden, the king himself must be Lutheran. In England, the king must be Anglican. Well, where does a Muslim fit in today's Sweden and Britain? Well, we kind of view that as, well, it's just symbolic. It doesn't matter. In India, where religion is much more a part of daily life, uh, it matters. And so it creates an exclusionary sense of the Indian identity.
How does that fit in with India's notion of democracy, though? I mean, we talk about inclusion here in the West. We
Yeah.
always have this moral superiority about what we are and who we are and how we
Yeah,
treat our fellow citizens, irrespective of where they come from, irrespective of the color of the skin, so on and so forth. In India, it's a democracy,
it is.
but it's a multi-sectarian democracy. And so, therefore, how does the religiosity and the democracy
It's a
fit
challenge.
together? Yeah.
Non-Hindus have absolutely full civil rights in India. There's never been any issue around that. But
Mm.
just as Australia, if you want to be an immigrant to Australia, you have to pass an Australian values test, and you have
Yep.
to at least say that you will embrace Australian values, whether you really do or not. In India, that same kind of logic is being applied, again, by political parties, not by the government itself. There's no moral test for being an Indian citizen, and there's no danger of non-Hindu Indians being expelled from the country. There's nothing. I don't want to overstate the case. However, the turn towards Hindu imagery among a governing, and not just the governing party, the opposition party in India, the Indian National Congress, has had much the same transition in its use of language and its use of iconography. The Indian opposition leader, uh, Rahul Gandhi, recently did a march around India, an India Freedom March, but he called it by its Sanskritized name, the Bharat Jodha Yatra. So he didn't, Yatra is a Hindu pilgrimage. Bharat is the Hindu name for India. So even the quote unquote secular opposition in India is adopting this Hindu centric sense of Indian identity, even as they appeal for Muslim votes. So this is a broad-based issue in India. I've written quite a lot about this, that on the one hand, India has very good social indicators for Muslim Indians, and they're doing well, and there's no sense of there's no problems of civil rights like there are in the United States for minorities, or even in Australia for Indigenous Australians, these issues come up. Um, However, there are questions of inclusiveness and the extent to which non-Hindu Indians are being included in the rhetoric of politicians and national organizations of what it means to be Indian.
Okay, so is India a secular power, Or is India a civilizational power? And what would it mean if India is a civilizational power? Because this term had been bandied around for
Yeah.
other large nations, China, for instance, Iran, for instance, because these are ancient
Yeah.
civilizations going back into time, in the mists of time, I should say. So, what do we make of India in terms of the way that it portrays itself? Does it see itself as modern and secular, or does it see itself as the modern inheritors of this ancient culture moving forward?
Interestingly, the term civilizational state was first coined with regard to India. It was popularized after Martin Jacques referred to China as a civilizational state, and most Indians are unaware that the term originated in India.
Yeah.
It was an Indian social scientist who called India a civilizational state. It went to China, and now I think many nationalistic Indians are very jealous. If China gets to be a civilizational state, we get to be a civilizational state in India. And I laugh at it because the fact is that it has no basis in reality. India is a modern nation state. Whenever confronted with the awkward realities of the implications of the civilizational state label, its advocates run for cover. So, for example, obviously, um, you know, Bangladesh and Pakistan are part of the Indian civilizational heritage. I mean, the Indus Valley civilization is in Pakistan for the most part. What's in Bangladesh is a big part of the heart of Bengal. The Ganges River, the holy Ganges, empties into the ocean in Bangladesh, right? So these are certainly part of the Bharat civilizational space. Nepal, for that matter, is a majority, almost entirely Hindu country um, on India's northern borders. And is Nepal part of the Indian civilizational state? And people say, no, 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 we don't want to annex Nepal. We don't want to annex Bangladesh and Pakistan. I said, well, then what's civilization about your state? I mean, really, what you mean is India is a modern nation state that occupies the territory that goes back with a recorded civilization of 4,000 years, and that's fine. People can be proud of it, and really, make it their identity. But it doesn't change the fact that in practical, real world terms, India is a nation state. You might say that the Indian nation, that human bond, connecting people, is increasingly turning to Hindu civilizational language, and that the Hindu nation is increasingly identifying itself as a Hindu nation. Uh, but that hasn't changed the state. The state is a modern nation state.
Salvatore, when we had you on the show last, we were talking about India, not necessarily from the most complimentary position. We spoke about it as being a relatively poor country,
Yeah.
which I think got up the nose of a
Yeah,
few
people get
people who,
angry about that, but it's a
yeah.
statistical reality, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, well, I know, I get it, but hopefully, well, anyway, we get the brickbats and the bouquets irrespective. But look, the fact of the matter is that India is still an economic competitor in many ways with its neighbors. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, with China having its Belt and Road Initiative investment model, can India really be seen as an economic rival of China if it doesn't have something similar, if it doesn't try to copy
Yeah.
China, even at a baseline level, base rate level, I should say, not as rich, maybe,
Yeah.
not as infrastructure heavy, perhaps, but something similar.
India is a strategic rival of China, but not an economic rival of China. It's just another economy. Right? It
Right.
happens to be very close, but there's no trade across the Himalayas. It's a hard barrier. Even China and Pakistan trade is conducted by sea. Even though Pakistan is a part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and a member in good standing of the Belt and Road, it's just not practical to move across the Himalayas, or even for that matter, across the jungles that separate northeastern India from China. So these
Yeah.
are not competitors and they're not partners in any sense. They're simply separate areas. India's economic development has gone along very different lines from China's. It is not a export consumer goods based economy. It has a much more broad-based economy. The chief challenge in India has been low productivity agriculture, which again doesn't have anything to do with China or the China model. It'll take reforming India's domestic economy for it to grow. Now, a statistical reality that most people have no idea of is that it's often said that China exported its way to growth while India is not an export economy. In fact, exports as a percent of GDP, not total exports, but as a percentage of GDP, are higher in India than in China. So India is more export reliant, so to speak, than China is. But most of that is value-added re-export. So I already mentioned petroleum products, India's largest export. Petroleum doesn't come from India. It's brought in, processed, sent out. The second biggest category is diamonds and gemstones. Again, they're not mined in India. They're brought to India, processed, sent out. Third biggest area is pharmaceuticals. Again, the chemicals, ironically, often come from China. Those chemical precursors are processed in India. The pharmaceuticals are exported. Those are the top three export categories in India. So it's a very different economic model from China's. That said, people see one example like China and they just think that's how growth happens. Statistically and theoretically, we have no really good reason to believe that. Growth occurs because countries improve their levels of productivity. Some countries have done that while exporting. So in China, the communist administered parts of the economy remain the lowest productivity parts of the economy. Things like the oil industry, the steel industry, all of the large
the military industry,
manufacturing, military industry, all of these, well, military equipment manufacturing, all of these heavy industry parts of China are incredibly unproductive. And that's made up for by the export sector because China opened the export sector to international competition, and that sector became highly, highly productive. And when I say productive, I don't mean in terms of volume. I mean literally productivity, GDP per hour worked in that industry. The export industries are incredibly efficient, incredibly productive. India hasn't developed along those lines. India has a broad-based improvement in productivity going throughout the entire economy. Its export sector is not particularly a leading sector. Again, it's large in percentage terms, but it's not the most productive area. The most productive area of the Indian economy is likely the IT sector. IT exports get a lot of publicity in the West, but they don't actually amount to a large amount in total aggregate terms. So India's broad-based productivity growth is a different model of economic growth than opening up one sector to international competition, as China did. But they're getting to the same place. The important thing for GDP is not whether you export or not. I mean, the US is the world's largest importer, yet it's the world's most productive economy. Right. It's what matters for economic growth is that a country have high productivity. And India is moving that way, but in a very different way from China. The only specific area where India is a direct competitor to China, and it's highly visible, is export of iPhones. India has become an alternate production hub for iPhones. And even there, it was mainly created to serve the domestic Indian market. But while Apple has the factories there, it may as well export as well and establish a secondary export hub in India. Other than iPhones, there are very few industries where India directly competes with China.
This is really interesting, and I want to dig down a little bit more into this later. But for now, let's just have a look at India's expanding presence in Africa. I mean, is this the start of a genuine South-South leadership role or just opportunistic competition with China?
First of all, it's not driven by competition with China. Indians are not saying China's in Africa, we need to be there too. It's driven by searching for export markets and searching for investment destinations. I suspect Africa is more important right now as an investment destination than as an export market. That is, Indian companies want to scale up and they view Africa as a place where they can scale up. And a lot of the reason for that is simply that Africa is a very low productivity area of the world. You don't have to be especially high productivity to succeed in Africa. Whereas, establishing a presence in Australia or the US or Europe is much more difficult. And so Indian companies are seeking to establish presence in Africa, and where the companies go, ultimately, consular services will arrive. But again, there's been no rhetoric at all in India about establishing military outposts in Africa or establishing strategic relationships in Africa. It's all driven by individual investors who want to make money in Africa. Chinese business people, although many went there just to make money, many were sent there strategically by the Chinese government. Now, I'm not talking about the small shop owners. All over Africa, there's small Chinese shop owners. Those are just people who went out to make some money for themselves. But the big industries, China getting involved in African rail, getting involved in construction projects in Africa, in infrastructure projects, building power plants, that was very much the government of China wanting to subsidize industrial activities in Africa in order to create a strategic competition with the United States. There's no talk in India whatsoever about strategically competing in Africa by sending Indian industry to work there.
You're listening to the Focus Podcast. I'm John Bruni. If you find value in these deep dives into global affairs, please hit subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with your networks. It's the simplest way to support independent analysis. Now back to our conversation with Professor Salvatore Babones. Salvatore, strategic commentator Peter Zine argues India is unusually resilient as globalization unravels. It's energy secure, agriculturally self-sufficient, and less dependent on trade. Does that make India a self-contained geopolitical unit?
Well, so I disagree with two premises of that question. First, the globalization is not unraveling. Globalization is stalling. Those are two different things. It's just
Right.
like when an economy stops growing, it doesn't collapse. It just hums along at its existing level, much like Australia has last 10 years. And the same with
Mm,
globalization. Globalization rose very rapidly, and then we reached peak globalization around the global financial crisis, around 2009. And globalization has stayed stable so global trade as a percent of GDP has been stable. I guarantee you that despite all the talk of tariffs this year, 2025, when we come back in 2027 to have this conversation, they will have shown no noticeable effect in global trade flows as a percent of GDP. It's just not going anywhere. There's been no reduction in U.S. imports as a result of Trump's tariffs. Now, there have been small changes in what country something comes from, and at the margins, there have been changes. India's seafood industry has seen the effects of Trump's tariffs, but broadly speaking, global trade as a percent of GDP is not going to dip in 2025, and it's not going to dip going forward. It's just not expanding at the rate it used to expand. And the second thing I'd take issue with is India is not very dependent on trade because, of course, as I said earlier, India's exports as a percent of GDP are higher than China's, right? I mean, India is literally, in terms of percent of GDP, more trade dependent than China. And if we have a paradigmatic case of a country that depends on trade,
mm,
it's China. So on both counts, I think the premise is just wrong. That said, although I disagree with the premises, I agree with the conclusion in that the Indian economy is very robust because growth in India depends on rapid changes occurring in India right now. What we're talking about, the effects of global trade on India, is the effect of GDP growth being 7.2% or 6.4%. And while for Australia, that kind of swing, I mean, if growth in Australia is 1% or 0.2% is something we would really feel. That
mm,
0.8% means a lot. In a country growing that fast, it's the rounding error. I mean, we can't even predict Indian economic growth very well quarter to quarter because the variability is just so high. When countries are growing very rapidly, our surveys, remember, economic predictions don't come out of an economist's head. They come out of survey data about the economy. And the survey data is based on the economic activity that occurred in the base year, which is usually 2 or 3 years ago. Well, all that's out of date in India because the economy's changed so much in 3 years. I mean, 3 years, that's 25% economic growth, right? I mean, it's a whole different economy. So economic projections in India are so difficult that we won't even notice. That is, it'll be impossible to tell whether that plus or minus 0.4% in the economy is due to globalization issues or was just random variability in the economy itself. So it is very robust. The rapid growth makes it so. There's just so much unmet demand in India for infrastructure, for consumer goods, for employment. So many people want to move to cities, take up employment, that it overwhelms all the statistics. I mean, I'll just give you one last little example. India's unemployment rate has been relatively stable throughout the Modi years. And he's been criticized. Oh, you haven't brought down unemployment. All this talk about economic growth, and we still have unemployment. What people miss is the number of people employed has increased by an astronomical number. So it's just the labor force has been growing so rapidly that it can't absorb all of the people who are moving in from poor rural areas into the cities, into formal employment, with the result that there's continuing high unemployment. But that's not the same people. That's people who are coming in and they take 3 months to find a job in these rapidly growing cities. It's not that there's a high number of people who are permanently unemployed. So the economy is just so dynamic that whether globalization, booms or busts for a few years, really won't make much difference in India.
People like Peter Zeihan have been claiming that, China's on very thin ice and it's going to collapse within our lifetime, probably within the next 5 to 10 years at the outside. Now, if
I
those
have been hearing that since the early 2000s. I'll just
so have I, but I'm using Peter Zeihan as my whipping boy right now
yeah,
because, a lot of people get their information from him. He's a very big YouTuber, great strategic commentator on so many different, aspects. But I think that sometimes it's important to go back to what the talking points are to then unpick them.
sure, sure.
So Zion says that China is going to fall apart, and when China falls apart, India is going to reclaim manufacturing. But as you said earlier, India is developing differently from China. Now, can we go into some detail on that? I mean, what do you see that makes India stand apart from China? Because when we look at economies, we
Yeah.
tend to think about factories. We tend to think that everyone's on the same similar kind of trajectory. Maybe India's 10 years behind China, but eventually it's going to catch up and it'll be just like China. And do you also buy into that notion that China is having significant problems now, or is it also just plateauing out at the moment? Because
Yeah.
there seems to be a lot of information out there suggesting that there's a demographic collapse that's happening
Yeah.
in China. That's going to obviously have a major impact on Chinese industries and the economy generally. And can India, no matter how it develops, come anywhere close to matching Chinese output, industrial output?
Yeah. Look, China's economy has stalled. That doesn't mean it will collapse. It just means that it's not growing rapidly anymore. And this is something I've been writing about since 2010 when I wrote my first article, saying, and I put numbers on it. I said the Chinese economy would stall around 2020. And I stand by that, COVID or no COVID. The Chinese economy stalled in 2020 and has been stalled since. That is, and that's not some kind of, prognostication with a crystal ball. That's based on standard models from endogenous growth theory and economics. And if we apply the standard models to China's growth, it had catch-up growth. That is, it was recovering from the ill effects of communism until it grew to a typical middle-income country level of productivity of around $10,000 GDP per capita. And China's been stuck at that level. I think will stay at that level. Now, China got there through production networks extending out from Japan. Japanese production networks first went to Taiwan and Hong Kong. Then, when they left Japan, when Japan started to get too expensive, and then they spread into Guangdong through Hong Kong, and they spread into Fujian through Taiwan, and they spread into northern China through directly from Japan, with Japanese companies setting up businesses in China because Japan became too expensive as a hub for assembly type work. That process of production networks moving into adjacent countries was replicated in Europe with Germany and sending production to Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic. So it's a similar process that's occurred on both sides of Eurasia. India is not tied into those production networks. There are very few cultural connections. There are very few business people making the trip. I mean, the Japan-China connection, I mean, China suffered horrifically under Japanese colonialism. But let's not forget, Japan was in China for decades until 1945, and Japanese businesses went back into China in the 1980s. There was only a 35, 40-year gap when Japan was not in China. Right. So those networks are long-standing networks that were just disrupted by communism. India has no such networks. India's development is not occurring through integration into global production networks. India's development is occurring because of its indigenous institutions. And I give people the example of education. So India is famous for its IITs and IIS, the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science, a collection of a dozen schools around India that turn out some of the world's best engineers and scientists. Well, India right now has a GDP per capita on a par with the African continent. India right now has a population that's only slightly larger than that of the African continent. How many IITs are there in Africa? Is the world scrambling to hire African engineers? Or is there an H-1B visa program in California to bring African engineers in the Silicon Valley? No. So India has this incredibly educated engineering workforce, yet its GDP per capita is still stuck at African levels. Now, that indicates to me that India is poised to grow well beyond those levels. Right? It has that labor force. And the same is true if we compare Indian and African infrastructure. Indian infrastructure is a world better, so we expect India to grow. Indian and African governance standards, tax harmonization, any indicator we want to look at, India is doing better than Africa on that indicator, except for one indicator, GDP per capita, where they're both on a par. So that indicates to me a future of rapid growth in India. And I expect that India will reach parity with China, GDP per capita parity, sometime in the early 2040s. Whether it be 2040 or 2045 or 2047, I can't tell you, but by 2050. That's not very far away. We're talking just a quarter century, 25 years away. Now, when that happens, there will be two Eurasian giants, India and China, with similar levels of economic output, but with very different structures. China will be closely integrated as the workshop of the world, major manufacturing exporter. And India will have a largely domestic economy. India, despite its large export flows, is still a net importer, whereas China is an exporter. They just have very different economic models, but all that really matters in the end is productivity. And as long as India has the infrastructure, the institutions, the human capital, productivity will ultimately catch up with where it should be.
How does that work from a demographic perspective? Because, as I mentioned earlier, the emphasis for most geopolitical analysts now seems to be we're hitting a demographic cliff, effectively,
Yeah.
right? So all societies, China, even India, just a little slower, are except for the African continent, we're all going to age much
Yeah.
faster. And that's going to have an effect, a knock-on effect on how many young people will enter the workforce. And so therefore, over time, we're going to be seeing a contraction of the market because there's just not enough people to produce goods
Yeah.
at the same quantities. Now, of course, people will be saying, especially those people who like science fiction, they will be saying robots will take over. Now, that may be true, although as the supply chain situation currently seems to be bearing out, robots take a globalized supply chain to function correctly. But if there are any disruptions to that,
Yeah.
you're not going to have your robot economy. They're not going to come in and replace people. So how does this all look, by 2040?
Well, depending how you define a robot, robots have been replacing people for 300 years now. And the more robots replace people, the more productive we will become. But the real issue here is not the size of the population. It's the age distribution of the population. So China will have an increasingly large dependency ratio, meaning that there'll be more and more elderly relying on a smaller and smaller working age population. Now, there's some ability to fight against that by increasing the retirement age, since, of course, we're all becoming elderly societies because we're all healthier. And since we're all healthier, we can now work into our 60s, 70s. Work is also less physically demanding than it used to be. I mean, sitting in an office is not shoveling coal. And people who are 70 and 75 may not want to sit in offices, but of course they can sit in offices. So partly this age dependency ratio will be mitigated by the fact that older and older people will be working and will be economically productive. That said, China's demography is not favorable. It will lead to what we might call headwinds against economic growth in China. It will make it more difficult to grow, just as Japan has faced headwinds due to its aging population, making it more difficult to achieve economic growth. There's not going to be a collapse. Any changes will be slow. So if China does ultimately decline from 1.4 billion people today to the best guesses are around 800 million people at the end of the century. That's a 40% reduction in population. That will, of course, reduce the total size of the Chinese economy. But what we're really interested in from a policy standpoint is not the total GDP, but the GDP per capita. And China's GDP per capita can survive that long-term slow accretion of challenges to remain at its current level. I don't think it'll grow much, but I think it can remain at its current level, at least current level vis-a-vis the rest of the world. India has very favorable demographics. It currently has a fertility rate around 2.05. It depends which source you want to look at, but between 2 and 2.1. But the trend is downward. So right now, India has a replacement level of fertility. It will, in the next 20 years, tip over into demographic decline as well, but it's more favorably positioned than China, certainly, or for any of the East Asian countries, which means that it will have a longer lead time before it has to deal with these problems of an aging population. So, on balance, and I want to stress, I'm a gradualist here. There aren't going to be any collapses. On balance, India will find it easier to grow for the next 50 years. China will find it harder to grow for the next 50 years. Neither one is going to collapse, but there will be greater challenges facing the economies. Now, the global economy will become smaller overall as rich countries experience demographic decline, balanced by economic growth. Now, whether the GDP per capita growth will compensate for the demographic decline, it'll probably balance. I mean, the global background level of GDP growth, just based on technological improvement for the last 160 years that we've been able to measure it, is around 2% per year. The economy just grows at 2% per year due to improvements in technology. Will the demographic decline outweigh that? Well, it might put a 1% per year headwind on it, so that total GDP only grows at 1%, even though GDP per capita grows at 2%. The world will survive that. Now, of course, if you extend it out forever, humanity will disappear. But within our lifetime, you will remember when we were children, when we were being told population growth was exponential and we were going to run out of resources. Because and if you extend any trend forever, you end up in trouble. I don't know what will happen after 2100, but between now and the end of the century, we'll be fine.
Oh, well, that's great news.
Great news for us.
Yeah, great news for us, for sure. Well, it's interesting because when you listen to a lot of the doom porn that's out there, and it becomes almost like an earworm in people. Even for skeptics like us, we may not want to believe it, or we may not even believe it. There may be countervailing evidence to suggest a totally different environment, but that constant niggling in the back of one's head, you have to wonder, is this real? What is real?
Look, John,
How's it gonna...
this is why the doomsayers are on Joe Rogan and I'm on John Bruni.
Amen,
John,
Salvatore.
because John Bruni and I are having a reasonable discussion about actual factual events in the real world. and that's just not as sexy or popular. Look, China expert David Shambaugh wrote a book, and I think it was 2004, talking about the coming breakup of China, how China was going to disintegrate into, I think, 6 countries or something. Guangdong was going to become independent. And
Yeah, yeah,
he
yeah,
is
yeah.
still giving lectures, paid lectures around the world on the basis of his fame from this book.
So
And you
if
just
it
think,
bleeds, it leads, Salvatore.
if it bleeds, it leads.
Right,
Absolutely. And these
right.
doomsaying predictions are very popular.
Mm,
They're the key. If I wanted to become a really popular global public intellectual, I would be the merchant of doom, and I'd marshal all the statistics to try to support that. But the
yeah.
fact is, a fair and balanced look at the statistics doesn't indicate any immediate catastrophe ahead. It's just like with global warming. Is it, and sorry to take the podcast completely astray, but is it a good idea to burn all the fossil fuels laid down over 100 million years in the course of 1,000 years? Yeah, it's probably a bad idea. Um, are we all going to be underwater this century? No. Is the Earth going to
Mm,
become
mm,
unlivable in this century? No.
mm,
Are we even going to know? No. I mean, so the catastrophists get all the um, make all the running, and the anti-global warming activists, make a lot of noise. The fact is, we should probably just, be cautious, monitor things, keep on an even keel.
mm.
And the same is true for all of these economic and demographic statistics.
You
There
know,
are
it's interesting.
things to be worried about, but they're not things to
Yeah.
be alarmed about.
Just going back onto the whole green thing, Salvatore, for a moment. I mean, what was it in 2019? I went to New Delhi for a conference. And I have to say, I absolutely loved my time there. I mean, the way that the Indians look after their national monuments, like the Taj Mahal or, the Red Fort in Agra, oh my God, it was just amazing. It was truly amazing. But the one thing that got to me in the end was the quality of the air.
Yeah,
Come day five, I
yeah,
was,
and it's
not in a
still and
good.
it's still catastrophic.
So what does a country like India do to improve the conditions of its people from an ecological standpoint? Because I mean, look, a healthy economy really depends on the health of your workforce, and if you're all choking to death on really
Yeah,
foul air, that's not
it's
going to help you.
what happens is its economy, its GDP per capita doubles, and it starts to invest to improve it. India being a democracy, India is already addressing the issue. That is the concern. The complaints about air quality are very prominent in the national newspapers. The government is very aware that people care about this. Efforts are now have started actually several years ago to improve air quality, particularly in Delhi, but also in the rest of India. Now that's starting now in India at $2,500 GDP per capita. Similar efforts didn't start in China until $5,000. GDP per capita because China's a communist country, can do what it wants.
Yeah.
It doesn't care about popular opinion. So I'm very hopeful for India on this. The fact is that these problems are easy to solve. It just requires, and they're not even expensive to solve. It just requires the political will to solve them. So the number one cause of air pollution in Delhi right now is construction dust. And construction
Yes.
dust doesn't require high-tech, expensive solutions. It just requires you put down a tarp over your sand pile. That sort of intervention. You water down.
Yeah,
You
you
always
water
see
it down. Yeah.
construction as being watered down. So
Mm,
these are easy to solve, and so you could get a quick win with lots of improvement. Um, you just have to have the political interest in doing it. It's not even expensive.
mm,
But India is a relatively poor country. Um, Efficient people are a scarce resource. So the Prime Minister's office in India has monopolized the control of the most effective public servants, pulled them into the Prime Minister, out of the departments, into the Prime
yeah.
Minister's office to focus on specific initiatives.
Mm,
And so, for example, the Clean India program to eliminate open defecation was wildly successful. And now virtually everybody in India has access to a toilet, and open
mm,
defecation has ended as a
mm,
socially acceptable practice. It's just not done, and you'd be considered crazy in India, no matter how poor you are, if you
mm,
defecated in public.
mm,
100% electrification, again, big national priority. It's gotten done.
mm,
The air pollution needs this kind of prime ministerial, we're going to focus on it, educate people, tell them what to do, make it happen. And it's happened to some extent. For example, one big national initiative was to end cooking over open flames. Now, this is something
Right.
that Beijing did. But Beijing didn't do this until I believe it was 2015, 2016, when they outlawed cooking on open flames and made everybody move to kerosene stoves. So,
Hmm.
Beijing was much richer than India when it made this transition. India made this transition before the last election. In fact, Narendra Modi was criticized for manipulating the vote by sending every woman in India, every poor woman in India got a kerosene stove and a framed picture of Narendra Modi saying, I've given you this stove. Subtext, please vote for me. Right. So, but because India is a democracy, these policies are getting done at a much earlier stage of development than they were done in China. And so I'm very hopeful for it. But until it happens, of course, it is excruciating to be in a major Indian city for more than a
Oh.
few days. And you feel terrible for those who live there.
Yeah, you really
Need
do.
it
No,
every
I
day.
mean, without a doubt, without a doubt. So, okay, so if we get back into the weeds of the economy, um, isn't there also a brain drain happening in India with top talent leaving for Silicon Valley?
Well,
I
not
mean, how
anymore.
much? Not anymore?
Well, this is what Indian commentators have been saying that the greatest thing that Donald Trump did for India was put a $100,000 price on the H-1B visa because it will end the
Yeah,
brain
yeah,
drain and all the Indian engineers will now start companies in India instead of going to Silicon Valley. So not anymore is just a joke. Yes, there is a
yeah,
major brain drain from India, and the two
yeah.
areas are medicine and technology.
Yes, yes.
And there's
So,
massive brain drain from India.
does India have the local cash necessary to invest in their own talent? I mean, and not at the same degree of, say, the United States, but enough for India to get by into the future, or is that
Look, the capital is there, and we have strong evidence on economic growth that it's never capital constrained. The capital
right?
will always invest in a growing economy.
Mm,
The challenge is the market there, and if the market's
yeah.
there and there are profit opportunities to be made, the capital will come.
Mm,
That is the economic. When we do very careful studies of the direction of causality between growth and investment, growth leads investment and drags it in. Investment, having an excess pool of investment won't cause growth. It's a pushing on a string versus pulling on a string
right.
phenomenon. Uh, that said, human capital is a very distinctive kind of capital. In a world without such open immigration opportunities, my guess is that India would develop more rapidly because the human capital would be there in India. That's purely a guess. It's very difficult to do econometric studies of this sort of thing, but it
Mhm.
seems logical that being deprived of massive human capital can't be good for the Indian economy. Now there are efforts made to link the diaspora in, but the most people once they've joined the diaspora, their real goal is to develop their lives in their new homes, not to
Yeah.
go back. There's always a backflow, and we hear these stories in the press all the time about some Indian Intel engineer who went back to India, founded a company, and now would
Mhm.
never leave India because it's so magnificent to be back home. But these are rare examples.
Mm.
The main direction is one way. And
Okay.
it's even more true of medicine and medical
Mm.
doctors leaving India, a country that certainly has much greater use for those doctors than the
Mm.
receiving countries do. But the
Indeed.
rewards are just so great in Western countries that you can't blame people for wanting to seize them.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, so final question, Salvatore. I've got to say, I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you very much for the time that you've devoted to the John Bruni podcast, not the Joe Rogan podcast. But that was great. Anyway, look, Trump's critics argued that democracy is at risk in the United States.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
America can't model sustainability at home, why should India, the Dharma Democracy, or anyone else take the US seriously?
Look, other people tell you democracy was in danger under Joe Biden, and it was in
Yeah.
danger under the first Trump administration. And then Barack Obama, remember, had a
Oh, yeah.
kill list. And oh, who was it? It was George Bush who maintained offshore torture centers. we can just go through it. It's
Mm,
democracy is not in danger in the United States. That said, the global narrative that democracy is endangered in the United States does reduce American prestige and to some extent influence in the world. That said, I'm not sure anyone ever was taking America's advice on these issues.
mm,
Certainly, civil society organizations in developing countries were very happy to take American money and to use it for their own purposes. So the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID and these organizations that pumped funds into civil society organizations, pro-American civil society organizations. But we have a long history that once these organizations attained power, they quickly forgot that they were supposed to be pro-American organizations. So, although I'm sympathetic to the thesis that these criticisms of the United States have reduced American prestige around the world, I'm not sure that it actually matters very much in a practical sense.
right, right. Okay, Salvatore, thanks for sharing your insights again on the focus.
John, it's great to talk to you.
Thank you. That was Associate Professor at the University of Sydney, Salvatore Babones. Okay, so as India navigates between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing while also reaching out to the Middle East, Africa, and the wider global south, it faces the ultimate test of whether it can turn opportunity into lasting influence. Whether India ends up as the smallest great power or the largest middle power, the choices it makes in this decade will shape not only its own destiny, but also the balance of the 21st century world. It is indeed a huge gamble. Now, on to questions for the audience. Is India really on the path to becoming a great power, or will its internal contradictions keep it stuck, as Peter Zion says, as a pocket power? Does India's reliance on Russian energy strengthen its global hand, or make it dangerously vulnerable to Moscow's leverage or lack thereof? In a world of fractured alliances and rising nationalism, can India credibly lead the global south without itself sliding into narrow identity politics? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at Bruni Doctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.